a lot of times our entrepreneurial set, we will use gut decisions, but they're not necessarily decisions, they're more like reactions. So today we're going to take it out of the reactive zone and put it into more of a clear intention zone. Hi friends, welcome to my signature masterclass, Ask Better Questions, Get Better Answers. This is the very first lecture that I point my students to when they're beginning to work with me here at Sensible Woo. It's a really powerful framework that helps you match your intuitive side with your practical side, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do it. It's really quite simple, but it involves some really powerful deep root work, and we're going to talk about that more in a second too. So with that, let's start with our high priestess, or lovely high priestess here. For those of you who are tarot card nuts, this is the high priestess from the Tarot Illuminati deck. Has a deck with beautiful artwork. So she is going to be our intuitive guide today. And she always asks us to go ahead and feel our intuition. So she also reminds us that the question is just as important as the answer. If you've ever had a really good reading, for example, you know that the process of the reading is often the thing that we enjoy more than just simply getting an answer, right? There's this self-discovery process. If you're a coach, you know that your coaching clients, they sign up with you because they want to go through the process of getting to a resolution on something. And that's what we're doing here as well. So what we're really doing by asking better questions to find better answers is coming up with a clear intention, which allows us to clarify our goals even further. And then you'll see throughout today that you always have a choice. You can keep digging or you can change directions. I always say that sometimes there are better times and places to ask questions, and you're going to see that show up in this framework. And you always have the choice to say, you know what, I think I need to put that down right now. Or maybe now is not the best time. Or maybe I'm not ready for that yet. And you discover these things about yourself, and that's what we're really trying to do here. Then we're going to put on our logical side. We're going to think like Barbara Gordon here. Barbara Gordon, if you're not familiar with the comic book lore, is also known as Batgirl. And this image comes from an American Libraries Association poster, read poster. And the tagline says, "Librarians are superheroes every day." So I love this poster. And Barbara Gordon is a librarian. Her character is a librarian. She runs a thing called the Info Network. And what we are doing is we are channeling our inner Barbara Gordons so that we can pay attention to keywords and do a proper research process. So what we're doing is we're making sure we're using words that are being used out there in the world, not the terms that we want to use, right? So we're making sure that we check our ego responses and that we start looking outside of ourselves. We start developing this situational awareness through this process of developing better questions so that we can have clearer answers. So as we find our breadcrumbs, they will lead us to more information. So depending on the kind of questions you have, they may be much more factually based. And if that's the case, you're going to be invoking more of this sort of librarian side of yourself. If your question is more, emotionally based, you may be calling on your intuitive side more. And what we do is then we look at the intersection of our logic and our woo. So, we have our high priestess on one side and we have Barbara Gordon on the other. In the middle is where the two meet. And a lot of times we ping pong back and forth between the two spaces. But I have found that we are rarely only in one space or the other. We are often pulling from both, more often than we actually give ourselves credit. And so I always like to remind my clients that we really do use our logic and our woo on a daily basis. I mean, it's one of the big reasons why I named my business Sensible Woo, because a lot of times our entrepreneurial set, we will use gut decisions, but they're not necessarily decisions, or more like reactions. So today we're going to take it out of the reactive zone and put it into more of a clear intention zone. So we start with a holistic approach, but what does that mean, right? So here at Sensible Woo, a holistic approach means three things. We fairly and honestly assess your current emotional state. And the reason why we do this is just so that we have an awareness of, where am I at in this emotional process? If it is a tough season for you, it means that your intuitive spaces are probably going to feel a little bit more foggy, which is where having a linear process like this is really going to help you sort out your emotions and your thoughts so that you're making better decisions instead of gut reactions. And then we're going to check our ego response, because it's really tempting for our ego to take over the driver's seat and drive the whole car. And our egos, we want them to be there with us, because seriously, your ego is like your ultimate best friend. Your ego is always going to have your back, always going to be there to protect you. We just don't need the ego making all the decisions, though, especially when it comes to finding answers that we really need and not just looking for things that we think we want to hear. And then we're going to make sure we ground ourselves at all times, at the beginning and at the end. So we are going to start with an opening affirmation. You're welcome to use mine if this helps. Different things work for different people. Some of you might enjoy like a minute of mindfulness or a little bit of meditation. But either way, make sure you ground yourself however that works for you. So here's the opening affirmation. I call upon my higher self to show me all aspects yet unconsidered. I call upon my ego to have a seat and stand aside for my highest and best good. I give myself permission to accept and acknowledge what I know I must do to ascend on a higher path. Thank you. So now that we've been able to take a deep breath and ground ourselves, we can move forward. So how do we use this resource? First, you're always going to be patient and kind with yourself. Always, always. I hope it should go without saying, but sometimes we just need to remind ourselves to give ourselves some space and some grace, right? And then the second thing we want to do is remember that perfection breeds paralysis. So we want to stay out of analysis paralysis. We want to keep moving forward. And you want to give yourself permission to revisit, revise, restart as many times as you want. Sometimes we think things are like one and done, and especially as entrepreneurs, we like decisions to move along. We want results. But sometimes you just need to give yourself permission that sometimes you need to play in that messy middle a little bit, right? And that can actually be a highly productive space. So as many times as you need to revisit or revise things, make sure that you give yourself the space to do that. Then remember that this is an interactive resource. So next to this video, you will find a PDF handout where you can print out these exercises, you can write on them, you can use them as a template for writing in your journal. And I really recommend that that you do write things out, which brings us to point number 4. So thinking in your head only gets you so far. We often credit our memory with things it does not deserve credit on. So we want to make sure that we are remembering accurately. And if you really want to make progress on your goals, you have to be able to revisit what you said earlier. And the best way to do that is simply to record those thoughts and those conclusions. So this allows you to then change and evolve with more precision. And one of the chief things that I see happen with my entrepreneurial clients is an assumption that their memory is going to retain all of that information, and then they end up taking longer to get to their end goal when they could have gotten there faster with a lot more accuracy by simply writing things down as they go through the process. Our 5th point, be careful what you ask. You just might get your answer. So this is the very first cautionary lesson that I give my clients for Tarot and Akashic Records readings if they've never had a reading with me before. What happens is a lot of times we will come into a process and we'll fish to hear what we want to hear, right? And what happens when we do that is we set ourselves up for really difficult emotional work. What we really want to be doing is coming to a place of acceptance. So just remember that you are responsible for the information that comes back to you, even if it's not what you expected. And as you go through this framework, you might discover that some of this starts to creep up. and that it's okay. But remember, point number two, you can revisit and revise this at any time. You can take a break at any time, right? If you discover that you've been fishing to hear what you want to hear and you're realizing like, oh, wow, I've got a tough emotional moment coming up here. Give yourself some space, right? Be patient and kind with yourself and then work through it on the time frame that works for you. Now, if you bump up against strong emotional resistance, give yourself permission to step away, take a break, just like we were saying. I find that most questions do not need to be answered immediately. And sometimes they take a long time before reaching an answer. I think sometimes we think things will happen faster than we give ourselves credit to, to really understand. And we just need to slow down for a minute. And then if you feel like your information needs to sink in, I recommend that you take a walk or go do something physical. Usually, helping your headspace integrate into your physical body is a really important action that can help move this process forward a lot faster. I mean, it seems ironic that to step away and take a break will make the whole thing move forward faster, but it's actually really true. So sometimes too, I find entrepreneurs a lot of times are up in their headspace a lot. I work with a lot of empaths where it's uncomfortable to be in the body because they're feeling a lot of emotions from all sides. And so what we do is we train ourselves to be more embodied in our businesses, just like we looked at the beginning, right? Working down into that root chakra, and that's where we're going to go today. So we're going to start at the beginning, and the beginning is not the question. The beginning is all about, what expectations do you have with this question? And what are you really hoping to achieve by asking this question? And so let's really dig into that. Let's look at that. Sometimes people get to this first step and they discover oh, I just saved myself oodles of time and energy and emotional strife because I realized I can put this thing down, right? My expectations are totally and not in the right place. And the thing I really want to achieve is actually over here. So doing this exercise at the very beginning can be super impactful. It's also something that you can revisit. And we are going to do a little check and balance before we get to the end. So you definitely want to examine your expectations. Now we're going to state our question. So first thing, state your question. Keep in mind that you might change your question later, and it's totally okay. Chances are you're probably going to change your question later. Just going to tell you now. So fill that in your little blank tarot card, as you can see here. And then ask yourself, how does this question make you feel? Now that you see it written out, how does this question make you feel? I find that a lot of times people say they have a question, and it turns out that they have never really put words around it yet. So it's kind of like in that chakra map, right? The callings come in through the head. They've had a vision of it, but they've not vocalized it, right? So we're helping it drop down into the throat region. So now we want to ask, how does it make us feel? We're going to feel it in our heart region after we've been able to put language to it. So are you energized or exhausted? Are you inspired or are you afraid? What is the thing that you're feeling? Maybe it's a whole bunch of things, right? But let's unpack that, because sometimes those feelings are giving us really good breadcrumbs and clues about what's really going on with this question. So once you've stated your question and you've examined your emotions around it, now we're going to evaluate it. So based on what you felt in the previous slide in question number 2, do you want to move forward with your question? So this is the first checkpoint. Are you ready for this? What is the emotional season that you're in right now? If the answer is no, I don't want to move forward with this question, give yourself permission to walk away from your question. This has been one of the most powerful things I've done with clients on the reading side of my business. And when I work with entrepreneurs and we incorporate the intuitive reading aspect into the coaching work, it's amazing how many times having someone give you permission, sometimes giving yourself permission to walk away from something that you're I'm just not ready for that right now. It can help you go do amazing things in another section somewhere else. So just know that it's okay if you need to release, you can do that right here. But if based on how you feel in part 2, if you're yeah, I do want to move forward with this question, then we'll go to the next box. So based on what you felt in part 2, Do you want to revise your question? So as you've examined how you feel in your heart center, maybe you want to rewrite your question to accommodate your feelings, right? Maybe that's an important thing. And as you do that, if you need to revise anything again, remember, rework, revise, redo, do it as many times as you need to. Take your time with it, but just make sure that you don't get stuck in analysis paralysis. Now we're going to unpack one of my favorite things, which is how many questions are you really asking? So when I was sitting on the reference desk as a librarian, people would walk up and say, I have a question. And I'd say, great, tell me your question. And after they started formulating it finally, we would discover that they had like 5 questions packed into one question mark. And if you discover that this has just happened to you too, you are not alone. It's a really common thing that a lot of us do. So we just want to be honest. We want to look at the question with a critical eye and determine, is this thing asking more than one thing? Now, keep in mind that there's a big difference between a really big question, like a big meaty question, and a question that's just simply packing too many things into the single space. So if your question is more than one question, it's more than one thing, split apart all those questions and then start over at part 1 for every question, right? Usually they have to do with like a sequence of events, or they're part of just like a really big picture. And it's not just about a launch, it's about systems and software and staffing and client, ideal client questions and offer messaging. And there's just a lot in there. It's not really about a launch at that point. And then if you discover that you have all these separate areas that need to be investigated, see if you can rank them in some kind of a priority. What feels like it's the highest priority right now? And do this wildly imperfectly, okay? You might discover as you go through this that you started with one, you thought it was a high priority. You get back to this point and you realize, wait a minute, I don't think this is the highest priority. I actually need to start with that other one. And that is okay too. But do this to the best of your ability and then just tackle those questions one at a time. But it's important that you do this step, because if you try to move forward a boulder that has all these crumbling parts to it, it's going to be a lot harder to move it, right? So make sure that you give yourself some space to actually investigate all the facets of this issue. But if it's just one really big meaty question, know that sometimes it just means the process might move a little slower because there's a lot to examine within that. But there is a big difference, and you'll know the difference between a really big meaty question and something that's just like a whole bunch of questions packed into one space. Now we're going to ask, why are you asking your question? Do you feel any sense of obligation or duty? Do you have any coulda, woulda, shouldas that you need to release? So if your thought process is kind of going like, I think I should ask this question because fill in the blank, then what you want to do is go back to part 1 and keep reworking your question until it's truly your question, right? You want to make sure the expectations belong to you. You want to make sure that the achievement that you're doing is not because you're trying to do it for someone else or to meet someone else's expectation or anything like that. So this should really be for you. So ask yourself that why question. So we're kind of examining the expectations again here. Now we're going to look at who has your answers, right? Is there someone that you need to talk with to fill in your information gaps? And at this point, if you need any professional counsel, whether it's medical or, mental health, or maybe you actually need to finally hire that coach, right? Just make sure that you seek the appropriate assistance. One thing I've seen with entrepreneurs that is really beautiful when it does happen is somebody gets to this point and they realize that one of the best things they can do is, work with that coach or their therapist on, really significant anxiety and mindset blocks. And it actually is the most impactful thing that they can do to solve their way to this answer, right? So if you need somebody to assist you, like let's say you're dealing with a really technical problem and you just don't have that technical expertise, then that would be a sign that maybe you do need to work with that web designer, right? But is there someone who needs to help you with this? And then ask yourself again, are you asking this question for anyone other than yourself? If you're still feeling those statements inside of yourself, like I should fill in the blank, then you need to go back to part one and keep revising your question, right? I find that this issue comes up again with the who because we're dealing with the people, and sometimes we get our people kind of meshed up together, and we think, well, if I could only get the answer from that person, I would solve this problem for this other person. But where are you in the middle of that? So you really need to make sure that you take care of that for you and your business and your entrepreneurial journey. Then we're going to look at wants versus needs. I love this exercise because what you discover is that it's really easy to come up with wants, and it is a lot harder to come up with actual needs. Sometimes we say things are needs, but they're actually wants. So we're going to examine the wants first. Is there something that you want to ask that can add to or clarify your question? Keeping in mind that your wants are non-essential, and asking yourself, is the want imperative to your question, or do you need to address the want that you have in a separate question? Sometimes there are things that, facets that come out of these questions, and we're like, it's just this like really big point of curiosity, right? Like, I just really want to know like what would happen if XYZ happened, right? And it's not like you can't move forward with everything. It's just that it's one of those things that's in your space and it just won't let you go, but it's not essential. That's different from your needs, right? A need can definitely add to or clarify your question, and they are essential. It's like you cannot move forward with a question if you don't address this need, right? So in that case, you want to make sure that the need is clearly included in your question. And if so, it's time to edit your question and make sure that the need is accounted for inside of the question. And you can do that in this space here. But making sure that you separate wants versus needs can actually help you a lot of times simplify what it is you're asking about, and also help you move forward with greater momentum. Then we'll look at time and place. So sometimes there's a better time to ask your question, right? So if it's within your knowledge, if you were patient, would the answer naturally reveal itself to you at the right time? I find this question comes up a lot when my entrepreneurial clients are asking me, hey, can you just pull a couple cards and tell me, like, am I going to get that funding? Is that client going to come through? And the fact is, there's a deadline on some decision that has to be made, or there's a date when that announcement's going to come out, and it's coming up pretty quick, right? And it's not about predicting, right? It's about how much emotional energy am I putting on something that I just need to just let it go, right? If I'm going to move forward, it's kind of like carrying a really heavy backpack. You're like, if only I knew when that thing would happen. And it's just, not the time yet. We just need to be patient. But then there are other times that we have questions where the time has truly passed. Like that event is over, that relationship is over, whatever the thing is done. You can't go back and change it. And sometimes I find people continue to ask questions on something that is over and done with. And you have to ask yourself at this point, is it wise to continue asking this question? This is the tarot card point when some of you might discover that you have some emotional clearing work to do. But it is some of the most valuable work you can do, because just like that heavy backpack analogy, if you've been carrying around this heavy backpack for a really long time and you learn to put it down, how much lighter and freer will you be to move forward? And that can be a really beautiful discovery in this process. So on terms of place, this is a little bit more rare for most people, but sometimes you need to be in a particular place to ask your question. So like your physical location can impact the quality of information that you could possibly receive. And sometimes you actually need to like physically go someplace. And the best concrete example I have that's really easy to understand is a friend who is a genealogical researcher. And while she can find a lot of records for genealogical research online, not everything in this world is digitized, and some of the places that have these records of like family names and whatnot are in these like little towns where this little library or archive has like no staff and no funding. So they're definitely not digitizing, and they also don't really have the staff who can, you know, go pull the book for her on the shelf and look up a name and do all these things and verify it. And so sometimes she'll actually have to physically go to that place so that she can make an appointment and go pull the book off the shelf and do that research herself. And so that's just a really easy example to see where being in a particular place really impacts the quality of the answers that you can get. So hopefully that gives a little bit of context around that. And if you find yourself also discovering, like, I think I really need to be in a particular place to get part of the answer to this question or finish answering this question, then it will definitely pop up at this point in the exercise. Now we'll do a thing called variations on the theme, which I think is a really beautiful aspect of this exercise. And what you want to do is look at your question from all the possible angles you can possibly see it through. So you're going to list on the left, how many different ways can you ask this question? You know, write down all the variations there. Don't worry about being perfect. Don't worry about covering every possible angle, but all the ones that come to you that you can reasonably think of, and then look at the variations and ask if any of those variations helped you now gain clarity that you didn't have before. Maybe one of these variations is better than your original question, right? So do you need to change your question? And if you do, start over at part 1, edit your newly versioned question from this variation. And it's probably not going to take you as long as the first time around, but just make sure you go through all those checkpoints. Make sure that you're, you know, clearly being intentional on this question, and then that way you can move forward based on that variation. Now we do the reflection. So before we get to the answer, we reflect. What do you now know that you didn't know when you started asking this question, right? Do you feel like you still need a question answered? You know, this is that emotional checkpoint. You know, am I still looking for the answer that I want to hear? Or am I really getting towards an answer that I need that is helpful? And how is your emotional feeling now different from when you started asking your question? So in the very first section, we ask, you know, what are my emotions tied to this? And now you can compare, right? You've gone through this process and you can compare what has changed. Sometimes the change is small, sometimes it's really big, but it's worth reflecting on so you know where you're at in the state of making an intuitive decision rather than an intuitive reaction when it comes to business decisions. And here's where the answer really shows up. It shows up in our intuition. It comes all the way at the end. We're going to ask ourselves, what was the answer that you received? And then write it down, right? Record your answer. Because sometimes you might discover that you're going to go back and revise and revisit this whole process based on what came up on this round. Ask yourself if this answer is what you expected, and how is the answer aligned or not aligned with your expectations from the first part. Do you feel like you need to revise your question and try again? If you do, go back to part 1, stay curious. You know, this is where we do actual hand-in-hand work with our intuition instead of just like listening to these sort of gut reactions and making sort of impulse, what we think are decisions, but they're really reactions. And then ask yourself now that you see your answer written out, are you satisfied with this answer? So maybe you got a reality check. Maybe you feel like there's another layer to investigate further. This is where you can actually listen to your feelings, like real ones, not reactions, not anxiety, but like really listen to, what is my business's soul really telling me here? I'm totally connected with it at this point. And what is it telling me? This is your intuition talking to you. This is where we do woo work inside of our businesses. And it takes all these steps to strip away our egos and our assumptions and make sure that we get to this true, honest, intuitive point. And I hope that that helps you start to get some framework around getting your logic and your woo working together in harmony. So we're going to revisit again what we did. We did a holistic approach here. What we did in the past 11 steps is fairly and honestly assess our current emotional state. We checked our ego response many, many times, and we grounded ourselves. So I don't know about you, but I feel pretty grounded after going through that. And what we like to do here at Sensible Woo when we finish any big project like this is to just close it out, right? Have an opening and a closing. You'd be amazed how much having a small little ritual can help you find a lot of emotional freedom. So here's the closing affirmation I use inside of my business. I thank my guides and higher counsel for their truth and wisdom. I accept the truth that has been presented before me, even if it will take me some time to fully incorporate it into my life path. I honor the inner knowing that is within me at all times in all places. Thank you.